We are here to interrupt your regular scheduled programming for some breaking news.
It's a very dramatic intro, Nick.
I,
Yeah,
I
we
thought you
do
want a little
have
bit of drama to
it
start
is. I
things
did
off.
write that. You're right. We have a ton of great episodes on deck, but this is pretty important.
Yeah, two absolutely massive headlines just came out regarding Canadian real estate. So, we had to jump on them and cover it. The first one is Ottawa to expand 30-year amortization mortgages.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! I guess they are trying to prop up the housing market now. Things must be bad out here. I don't know if I want to see the data that they're looking at.
Yeah, it looks like it's the case. Number two, Dan, Ottawa is also raising the price cap on insured mortgages up to $1.5 million.
Oh man. I guess we're doing the buying power and more debt means affordability. Um, I don't know if like I said, I don't know if I want to see what data that they are seeing that made them feel that a policy measure that is inflationary on house prices like this was necessary.
Can you maybe explain what you mean there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll give you the highlights since we're basically going to show our work in this podcast. Going from a 25 to a 30-year amortization decreases your monthly mortgage payment by about 8%. Since your payment is what the banks use to qualify relative to your income, this would instantly boost buying power for first-time buyers who are subject to this extension by 10 to 15%. And the same thing applies to new houses, which was already announced before, but now they've made it for if you're anyone buying a new home, not just a first-time buyer, you get the same thing, that 30-year mortgage. So 30-year amortizations for first-time buyers on any house, 30-year amortizations on new houses for any buyer. But this comes at a big cost from my perspective. You pay 26% more interest on a 30-year mortgage than a 25-year mortgage.
Yeah, that interest payment portion often overlooked, but definitely should not be forgotten about. And you're right, Dan. This is massive news, and we are going to go over a lot of math in this episode. But they did announce this for, as you said, brand new homes, Dan, and now we're expecting and expanding it to all first-time home buyers as well.
Yeah, and that extension is really just the amortization extension is really just the first part, like you mentioned. There's two parts to this.
Right. And the next part is the plan to increase the insurable amount by 50% from 1 million.
Yeah, which honestly, like to me, kind of looks like an attempt to move up the price floor a little bit.
Oh man, I haven't heard price floor since I lost 100 grand on an NFT last year. Whew, that one
Did
hurt.
you actually do that? You're fully rich, eh?
Isn't like a price floor like NFTs though? I mean, a floor price is the lowest price at which a particular NFT, and for those not familiar, those are non-fungible tokens. You remember all the little apes that people were paying an obscene amount of
Don't
money
fund
for?
those.
So an NFT is a collection. It's listed as a sale on a marketplace, and it represents the minimum cost for buying any NFT from that specific collection, right? That's that price floor. That's that set. You start there and go up.
Yeah. Fortunately, this isn't the NFT Canadian NFT investor podcast, so that's the last time we're going to mention that. An economic price floor, which is makes a little bit more sense in the context of this, is similar to what you just described, but it would be a government imposed minimum price for a good or a service, which would prevent the price from falling below a certain level, effectively setting the lowest legal price that could be charged for a product. A common example of this price floor would be minimum wage laws, as an example. You can't pay somebody less than whatever, I don't even know what it is, but it's going up in Ontario, which set the minimum amount a worker can be paid. And in the context of housing or goods, a price floor can be imposed to insure producers. And technically, like, your development charge is technically your price floor, right? Because you gotta
Yeah.
pay that minimum. So you're not gonna do it for free. So and that's to ensure producers or sellers receive a certain minimum price for their products.
But the government isn't really setting a minimum price here with this policy necessarily, right? Like,
Right, that's true, because it is decided by independent factors. So like it's your development charge plus the cost to build it, plus the cost of the land, et cetera. um, But from my perspective, they kind of intend to do that by determining the buying power of first time buyers. So it's like it's not a price floor like in policy terms, but it's sort of economically will function similarly. First time buyers typically buy entry level homes. If these buyers are priced out of the market, there will be fewer sales at the lower end of the housing market, potentially lowering overall market activity and price. Programs targeting first time buyers boost purchasing power, right? The effectiveness of these incentives can prop up demand at lower price points, creating a floor, you could call it, below which prices are unlikely to fall as sellers anticipate demand from this group, the first time buyers. They're, as we know from Bank of Canada data, they're 50% of purchasers almost, I think 49%. So functionally, you just moved up um, the amount that this group is able to pay, not just like a small amount. Like I thought like, I always thought this policy would happen. We've predicted it a handful of times on the show. I thought it would go from like a million to 1.25, right? To go up from a million to 1.5 is just like, what is going on?
Well, man, that's how we do things here in Canada.
Yeah.
We big swings one way or the other, right?
That's a Texas-sized increase for sure.
Yeah.
But first-time homebuyers are the lowest price marginal buyer, right? And so they can really drive market growth, and they're also the least experienced buyer, which we'll get to kind of some reasons for that. But realistically, they compete with investors, right?
Yeah, no, this show being called the Canadian Real Estate Investor, obviously we cover all things real estate. But, I was going to ask, Dan, why is this policy so important for people such as us and a lot of our listeners who are investors or would be investors? Like, why are we covering it if it's specifically going to affect the first time home buyer?
Yeah, so it's a good question. First, I'll say like the 30-year AMS on new homes doesn't just affect first time home buyers, it affects all buyers. And so that would be for everybody, but we can't really do a whole episode on that policy, I don't think. I would expect that will increase investor demand for new houses, likely. Makes sense. And that's their goal. Like that's what they want to do because they're like, oh shit, the new construction is slowing down a little bit and we got to get some investor capital, that excess demand, rather than it going and buying older houses, and taking that existing housing stock away that could be immediately consumed by first-time buyers. Let's move that investor demand to brand new houses. So investors and builders are working together to get housing supply created. I get where this is coming from. I don't really like the execution because I don't like using debt as a solution for affordability, but we can get to that later. To answer your actual question, there's a few reasons really, right? So the first-time buyers, they are often tenants. I think there's a stat that we put in here, but a lot of them were tenants. So making it easier for them to buy actually makes them less likely to rent, right? And so this could have an impact on your rents in some markets, especially markets where homeownership is affordability and does compete directly with rents, like Alberta, Regina, etc. Investors compete in the market with first-time buyers. And from my perspective, I just mentioned this, they're the least experienced and therefore the least rational buyers in the market. So they have a high incentive to overpay for houses, and they have a qualitative incentive, like their heart's in it, right? There's an emotional aspect. And so their ability or willingness to pay a different price than an investor is there. I won't get into this much more because I don't want to just rag on first-time home buyers for being irrational consumers, but most people's journey in their purchase is they buy their first home, right? So if you're a real estate investor, you probably, in a lot of cases, you own your primary residence, maybe made some wealth that way, realize it's not a difficult way to achieve wealth in a market that we were in for the past 30 years. And you take some equity out and then buy the investment property. And so that's, again, another reason why it's important what's happening with first time buyers. And then finally, most people think about their home as an investment.
Yeah, now that last one, Dan, most people think about their home as an investment. We've covered that multiple times on the show, and it's kind of wild to me, right? I mean, approximately 70 to 90% of homeowners in various surveys that were conducted consider their home an investment. This number reflects a common view that real estate can appreciate over time and ideally will provide that financial security that we're all looking for, right? Okay, so let's do a quick refresher on a few things here. Let's start with the CMHC insurance to create some context here. Now, CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they've come up once or twice in the show, a Crown Corp that provides mortgage loan insurance.
And that insurance is mandatory for home buyers who have a down payment of less than 20% of the home's purchase price because they're in a higher risk position. And basically, the CMHC wants to eliminate risk on the banks.
Yeah, and exactly. And that insurance protects the banks, that lender, if the borrower defaults on that mortgage.
Yeah, so it's for the bank. Like, you as the home buyer don't benefit from the insurance, right? It's an important distinction from my perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Now, currently, CMHC insures mortgages for homes that are valued up to $1 million. This cap has been in place since 2012. Now, this is where you see that important distinction between a property listed at $999,000 versus anything over that $1 million threshold.
Yeah, and you can see a lot of activity in the price range below $1 million. Like, because again, Bank of Canada states that like almost 50% of buyers are first time buyers, but basically that like there was that bidding war earlier in the year, I think in February, right, in Mississauga. It was like a house. It was listed at like, it was under listed a lot, 650 or something like that, and ended up getting like 30 or like 50 offers, but it sold for 999,999. Why?
Yeah.
Because it's a CMHC insured buyer. Not like 50 offers and not a single person paid more than $1 million for it. And that just showed me, at least, where all of the demand was in the market. So that insurance premium that you mentioned is typically added to the mortgage and paid out over the life of the loan.
Yeah, exactly. And that premium rate can vary based on the size of the down payment that buyer is going to use. And that ranges from anywhere from, let's say, 2.8 to 4% of the loan amount.
And the top end, that 4%, you pay the higher premium, the lower the down payment you use. So 4% if you use a 5% down payment, which means if you're a 5% down buyer, you have less than 1% equity in your house.
Yeah, so a lot of this sounds kind of like a bad deal, to be honest. Like, why would someone want to have a longer amortization?
I mean, my honest answer is that we are a debt obsessed country and we have a financial literacy problem in Canada. And like this
Yep.
policy move would just drive that home for me. Like, a lot of people say that Canadians think about the payment rather than the price. Even when people are shopping and negotiating for the price on a house, they negotiate based on what the bank says they can afford based on their payment, not what they actually feel the price is worth. Most people actually wouldn't really know what a house is worth. So given that, I would say most people feel that they just became able to buy a little bit more house for a lower monthly payment. And honestly, a lot of people will do it. I think that this policy will be very, very well utilized, which it bothers me a little bit because you're just basically adding, young people, first-time home buyers, you're adding another 5 years in which they're in debt now. And you're increasing the amount of interest that they have to pay on said debt by 26%. So it's not like I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that that's not like a good outcome from my perspective. More interest, longer time indebted. And so, yeah, I think like right now, I would say most buyers max their budget and take the lowest payment they can get. And this just encourages more of that behavior.
Yeah, it kind of fuels that fire that we've been trying to dampen for a while and warn against, right? And this kicks that proverbial can just another 5 years down the road, right? I mean, the psychology of Canadians, quote unquote, buying payments rather than focusing on the overall price of things is largely driven by affordability, perceptions, and budget management. Now, this behavior is particularly evident in big ticket purchases like mortgages or car loans, where buyers are often more concerned with whether they can manage that monthly payment than the total actual cost of the asset, whatever they're buying, right? That car or that house.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the mortgage as an example, and we'll use a car payment as an example as well, because I think that this is a good one that a lot of people can really think about it more clearly. When purchasing a home, many Canadians are focused on the monthly mortgage payment, and it's not their fault. Like, that's literally what the bank uses to decide. They use your mortgage payment as a
the way
percentage
it's
of
been
your household
sold.
income, when we measure affordability in Canada, it's mortgage payment as a percentage of income or income to payment, right? Not income to price in a lot of cases. European entities, you'll see they'll use price to income. Here we use mortgage payment to income. Even rents, it's like always, what is it as a percentage of your monthly income? So this is the income versus expenses thing, right? People manage their finances on a monthly basis. You pay bills on a monthly basis. And so people often consider how much they can allocate from their income to their monthly mortgage payment without stretching their budget. They think about it in like that one at a time increments.
But it's not really one at a time increments because we're talking about long-term debt here, right? Mortgage terms often span 25 to now 30 years. And this long amortization period lowers monthly payments, making the overall cost of a home seemingly more manageable, even if the total cost of the loan, including, of course, interest, which we can't forget about, is actually much higher.
And this is where you end up with that like interest rate sensitivity. So even slight changes in interest rates significantly affect monthly payments, not just like on the ones that you already have, but if you're a buyer who's in the market, if rates go up, now all of a sudden your affordability changes drastically because you're not buying based on the price, you're buying based on the interest rate. So a rise in interest rates would force buyers to reconsider the house they can even afford, and even if the price itself hasn't changed, right? And this was a big factor in the drop that we saw in prices in 2022 because buyers basically said, "Oh my goodness, I can't afford anything on the market anymore." And even as prices went down, there weren't buyers piling into the market, even though house price declines outpaced interest rate increases. And it's because that interest rate sensitivity is impacted the way buyers perceived the cost of a house on a monthly basis, not on a price basis.
Yeah, exactly. Now, talk about perceiving and that perception and that kind of psychology behind this way of thinking, right? Like lenders will often present that maximum monthly payment, right? That's literally the way that it's taught, that's the way that it's sold. So they'll present that maximum monthly payment that a buyer can qualify for, leading them to anchor their decision on that dollar figure rather than trying to buy, let's say a less expensive home.
How dare you suggest that somebody ought to buy a less expensive home?
That is financial advice, actually.
Yeah.
That's the first time I can say that.
So, like I mentioned, that another easy way to think about it is car loans, right? I think it's probably the next most common like amortized credit product. A similar pattern occurs with this, right? Like I feel like when I first started looking, like when I was young, I used to buy, like used cars, and I was always afraid of like these car payments. And I think it was like 5 years was like the max, and now it seems like, they've realized that buyers often care more about the monthly car payment. You go to a car dealership or a used car dealership or whatever, and they're basically mortgage brokers. Like they make all their money selling the debt, not the car, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
But people, they care more about that monthly payment than the total price of the vehicle.
Yeah. So let's dive in a bit deeper into this car loan example. So let's say car dealers, again, as you just sent in, they often advertise vehicles based on that monthly mortgage payment rather than the sticker price, right? Think about this, $399 a month for 72 months rather than, hey, buy this $80,000 minivan that you probably don't need, or an $80,000 truck, or, that brand new white BMW because you just became a real estate agent. Now, making the purchase seemingly perceptively more affordable, even though that total paid over time is actually a lot higher because you stretch that payment out and you're paying more interest.
Yeah. When you buy a new vehicle, finance it, they give you that like sheet at the end that says like, here's the total cost of ownership. And the way it bakes in all your interest payments and all of that stuff. They don't have that for housing, right? But I imagine it would make most people barf if they saw how much interest they were paying and what their total cost of owning that house was over a 25-year AM. But anyway, just like mortgages, that you're getting these longer loan terms, right? 6 to 8 years now. And this has made vehicles appear more affordable by lowering monthly payments, even though it increases the overall cost because you're paying interest for a longer period of time, and interest is calculated on an annual basis. Buyers, again, prioritize keeping the monthly payments within their budget, even if it means extending the loan and paying more in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where we have to kind of consider that, your lifestyle versus your expenditure versus your cost. Now, many Canadians are happy to justify higher payments for that said lifestyle that we're all trying to achieve. Now, vehicles, by reasoning that if you can, quote unquote, afford that monthly payment, the total cost really doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, it's it's kind of like I don't love this. I think that it's kind of it's not good. And so I guess the question would be like, why do Canadians focus on payment? I do think that our economy, like you go to the US, like not everyone's driving a brand new car. In Canada, like there's and maybe that has something to do with like climate and there's so much salt on the roads here or whatever. I don't know, but like giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. But I honestly think it's just we're such a credit fueled economy.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the States. I was recently in Europe, and one of the main things I saw was the amount. Like, there must be 15-20% of the cars on the road must be brand new cars. Whereas you come back to Canada, and it's got to be like 80% of the cars are probably 5
Yeah, like
years or
yeah,
less.
yeah, like probably still have some type of financing on them.
Yeah,
Yeah, so a big piece of this comes from what I would call mental accounting. People organize their financial lives into budgets, and they think that most people really think in terms of, because we're not like a wealthy society here in Canada. I'm not saying that to be like negative. Our household savings rates aren't massive compared to other countries. We don't have a ton of equity or cash, and if we do, most of our equity or household savings is trapped in our houses as equity. And so people think about, okay, what can I afford based on my income? Because we have always had job security here in Canada for a pretty long time. And, the last recession, we didn't get hit that hard. I think that's about to change personally, throw a disclaimer in there. But most people think about what can I afford on a monthly basis rather than a large lump sum. And that makes it easier to mentally manage these expenses, right? It's almost like you're rationalizing, oh, it's not that bad, right? But then
yeah.
you don't think, oh, I just paid 150 grand for a vehicle. You're like, oh yeah, I can afford to pay for this for 8 years.
Yeah, exactly. We've normalized the debt that we're in, right? And in a low interest rate environment, which we were in for quite a while, Canadians have become very comfortable with high levels of debt. And the focus, again, Dan, as you were saying, has shifted from, hey, I can afford this, to, hey, I can service this debt. I can manage these payments, rather than minimizing debt or trying to understand what that actual total cost is over time.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think like we always talk about delayed gratification, like making sacrifices today that benefit you in the future. The debt and focus on payments is the opposite. It's delaying consequences, right? So since the total cost of a mortgage or a car loan is paid out over many years, the long-term financial burden feels very distant. It's out of sight, out of mind, right? The immediacy of the monthly payments feels more real and manageable.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how they're going to tier the CMHC down payment structure when they do increase it to 1.5 million. So here's a format for down payment requirements and mortgage insurance. So CMHC mortgage insurance, this is the current structure that goes up to $1 million. Okay, so homes under $500,000, the minimum down payment of 5% for the first $500,000. The next piece is homes between 500,000 and that 999,000, that 999,999 minimum down payment of 5%, still going back on that first 500,000, and then 10% on the portion between that 500 and that 999. And then we get to the homes that are $1 million and over. Now, CMHC insurance is not available for homes of that price category. Conventional mortgages, which are 20% down, are required for properties $1 million or more.
So I came up with sort of like a potential extension to 1.5 million. And this is my hypothetical format, which would, because I don't think there's details on it, but starting December 15th, if CMHC were to extend insurance coverage for properties up to 1.5 million, here's what I think it would look like. 5% up to the first 500,000, then 10% on the portion between 500 and 999, and then 15 to 20%. So they would require probably that full amount on the payment of the portion, or on the portion between 1 and 1.5 million.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'd take a wild guess and say you're probably not so far off. And if anyone from CMHC is listening to this, feel free to use Dan's idea. So let's take your example, Dan, and actually run some calculations on it for a theoretical $1.5 million home. Okay, so again, first $500,000, 5%. That is $25,000 cash needed. Then we look at that portion between 500 and 999. So that's 10% of that first 500,000. So that's another 50 grand. And then we look at the portion between that 1 and that 1.5 million, assuming with Dan's new tier with 15% down. So 15% of 500,000 is $75,000. So that total down payment, you've got the 25,000 for the first 500,000, 50,000 for that 500 to the 999, and 75,000 for that 1 to 1.5 million, which brings you to a grand total of $150,000, 10% of 1.5 million, which is some pretty crazy savings from what we are dealing with currently.
Yeah. That sounds like a pretty good guess, honestly. I think the crazy part is that this would get you like the best rates in the market. Like if you're an insured borrower, I think you typically get the best rates, right? And you also, if you're a first-time home buyer, a home buyer period, you get tax-free capital gains. And so this is where we've created this kind of perverse incentive for people to like take as much leverage as possible and buy the most expensive house that we possibly can, and um and just basically like ride the capital gains, thing in the primary residence. And this, I think this is why we're having this conversation on the Canadian Real Estate Investor Podcast, because most people treat their houses like they are an investor, right? Yeah. So anyway, let's move on to just some commentary from the government website about them increasing the amortization and the insurable amount.
Yeah, sure. So the Canadian government proposed changes to the mortgage market, expanding 30-year amortizations and raising the insured mortgage cap.
Yeah, so that's just what we summarized. And listen closely here because this part is important. First-time homebuyers and those purchasing new builds will be eligible for insured mortgages with 30-year amortizations, up from 25 years.
Yeah, that part is really interesting because they made it so that first-time home buyers get 30 years, but also that all buyers get it if they are buying a brand new unit.
Yeah, and I noticed that Steve Saretsky pointed out on Twitter that Freeland did refer to it as a supply-side solution, which means that, they want this to stimulate demand for supply to get new construction homes built.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that you're very concerned about the lack of sales for pre-construction in today's market, Dan.
I do think that when the lack of pre-construction sales hits the new construction pipeline, it could be the largest problem facing Canada's economy in a year or two. And I think that increasing the buying power of new home buyers, while I don't love it like at all, I actually don't think I think it's a little bit reckless from a policy perspective. If I haven't made that clear yet, I don't like the piling on more debt, but it is a way, probably not the best way, but it's a way to reduce that risk.
Yeah, I mean, I know you don't love it because you took the liberty of putting out a nice sassy tweet on it that I'm going to read here.
Did you just call my tweet sassy?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of sassy. Now, take it easy and let me read it here, okay? This is a Daniel Foch original here, read by Nick Hill, just to get things even more confusing. An important note among today's CMHC announcements: all home buyers got 30-year AMs on new builds. That's 10 to 15% more buying power for brand new homes with the same income. Remember when I said that we'd see a bailout for builders facing failed closings? This is the first layer.
That is a little bit.
Daniel Foch.
You're just projecting your own sass on my tweet. And I guess it does come off a little bit sassy when you read it in that tone.
It's okay. I put my sass tone on.
No sass intended.
Now, just a reminder that, as you mentioned previously, Dan, these changes do not come into effect until December 15th of 2024. So we're recording this in kind of mid-September. So we still have a few months before this is a reality here.
Yeah, and the government said that their aim is to help Canadians afford their first home by reducing monthly mortgage payments and lowering down payment requirements. Thus, again, just do the math. That means that you have to have more debt, right? So if there's less down payment and more payments over time, it's more debt.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland made the announcements on Monday, just September 16th in Ottawa, where members of Parliament are reconvening for the start of the fall sitting in the House of Commons. She positioned the changes as helping Canadians afford a first home. So that's how it was sold to Parliament.
Yeah. And I like I think it will help Canadians buy a first home. I don't think it will help them afford the first home because it's technically a financially worse decision mathematically, right? Like putting aside the time value of money and whatever. But anyway, this is where it becomes kind of important, right? A lot of Canadians use their house as a savings vehicle, which means that, they're paying principal down over the course of their amortization schedule, right? So maybe this would be a good time for us to interject and talk a little bit about one of my favorite things in real estate, which is amortization. So why don't we do a little quick refresher on amortization as well?
Yes, of course. Amortization from the Italian amortization. Um, no, it's not actually, but your
Well, it would be the
amortization.
same. Didn't we? We had this discussion already. I think they are like the same. They're both Latin-based languages. Probably comes
Yeah,
from the same, but it's not. It's not based on love. It's based on death, actually, because mort. It's the mort, not the amore
the
part.
death pledge. Remember, we got those shirts. Go buy one. Your amortization period is the number of years you will need to pay off your mortgage. The length of your amortization period can affect how much interest you pay over that life of your mortgage.
So historically, the standard amortization period has been 25 years. However, shorter timeframes and longer timeframes may be made available depending on the program, like MLI Select 55 years or the amount of your down payment, etc.
Yeah, exactly, Dan. Now, a shorter amortization can save you money as you pay less interest over the life of your mortgage. Your regular mortgage payment amount would be higher as you are paying off your balance in less time. However, you may build the equity in your home faster and be mortgage free sooner.
Yeah, so the amortization is basically how fast you pay back the money that you owe. A longer amortization period requires lower monthly payments. However, you will pay more interest over the life of your mortgage because you're paying down the money that you owe less, which means you're paying more interest on the money that you owe. And it would take you longer to build the equity in your property.
Now, Dan, you're known as a bit of a chart guy in the real estate community here in Canada, and you've said multiple times that you feel the amortization schedule is one of your favorite charts in real estate. Can you tell me and our lovely listeners why that is?
This could be the most important chart in real estate. I believe my quote was actually that it's the most beautiful chart. And that's because it shows how with every month that goes by, you pay less interest and more principal, which means that the rate at which your property pays itself off, if you're an investor, increases every month based on the same payment. That means that real estate improves as an investment every day that it goes by.
So, an amortization schedule is a table that shows how your loan is paid off over time, breaking down each payment into the two parts, which is principal and interest. So, here's how it works in simple terms. Okay. First is your loan breakdown. Now, when you take out a loan, like a mortgage, you agree to pay back that money that you borrowed, which is the principal amount, plus for the availability of that loan, you pay interest over a set period of time, like we just said, 25 or 30 years. Now, every month you make a fixed payment that covers both the interest on the loan and the portion of the principal that you owe.
And interest goes down over time. So at the beginning of the loan, most of your monthly payment goes towards interest because you owe a large amount of money. Over time, as you pay down the principal, the amount of interest that you owe each month decreases because the interest is calculated based on the remaining loan balance, which is shrinking every time you make a payment.
Now, as your interest goes down, guess what? Your principal goes up over time. At the start, only a small portion of your monthly payment goes towards that principal, which is the actual loan balance. That's the actual amount of money that you borrowed. Now, as the interest portion decreases, more of that payment goes towards reducing that principal amount. This means that you are slowly paying off more of the actual loan each month over time.
So let's just use a simple example. If you have a $100,000 mortgage at a 5% interest rate on a 30-year term, your first payment, a large portion of your first payment is going to go to interest, say $416 in interest and $84 towards the principal. Later payments, as you pay down the loan, the interest decreases. For example, after a few years, you might pay $300 in interest and $200 towards the principal. By the end of the loan term, almost all of your payment will go towards the principal and only a tiny amount toward the interest, because you will have paid off most of the loan, so you don't owe very much interest on the mortgage anymore.
Yeah, well said, Dan. Now, the last piece I want to add here, um, could this mean that we begin to lose tenants? Because as of recent data, around 80% of first-time homebuyers in Canada rented before purchasing their first home. Now, this statistic has remained relatively consistent in recent years, reflecting that the most common path is from renting to home ownership for many Canadians.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I think a lot of people like want to, you're very rarely seeing single income households anymore in Canada. Obviously, based on affordability, you need two incomes to afford a house. So a lot of people will want to experiment with cohabitation in the rental format before they go buy a place together. And then, you get used to making the payments and whatever it is. And this percentage would obviously vary slightly depending on the region, economic conditions, and housing market trends. For example, like major urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver, I mean, even where you're not seeing, like romantic partnerships, you're seeing roommates and a lot of co-ownership and, just like friendship or co-investment situations. That's where home prices are high, and a larger portion of first-time buyers might rent for extended periods while saving up enough money to transition into home ownership.
Yeah, and I mean, if it becomes easier for people to buy homes due to things like lower interest rates or more accessible mortgage financing or even government incentives, the tenant pool could theoretically and likely shrink as a result, and more people start to transition from renting to home ownership. However, the impact of the tenant pool size would depend on several factors.
Yeah, and the key factors that you would want to consider there is, if a significant number of renters can afford to buy, this would reduce demand for rental properties, causing the tenant pool to decrease, especially in markets where renting is currently a necessity due to affordability challenges.
Yeah, then we've got to consider rental supply and demand. Now, while home buying would reduce the tenant pool, the supply of rental properties may also decrease. Landlords may sell their properties, further reducing the number of rentals available, creating a shift in the rental market dynamics.
Exactly. And then you add on top of that population growth. So in regions with high immigration or population growth, which is pretty much everywhere in Canada at this point, the demand for rental properties might remain strong despite high home ownership rates. Newcomers to the country or the market often prefer to rent before buying. Statistically, I think it's on average 3 years that they would rent before they purchase a house. And this makes sense, right? Like, you move to a new country. I personally wouldn't just guess that I like a place enough to let, like a city that I live in enough, or neighborhood, to just go and buy a house. I'd probably like to test it out and feel the place out first.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit like, dating before hopping right into a marriage. And some people have that preference for renting, right? Not everyone wants to be a homeowner, whether now or ever. Even if it is easier, some people prefer the flexibility of renting, especially with cities with higher mobility like Toronto or Vancouver, where jobs and changes in lifestyle or choices can make renting more attractive. I mean, Dan, you and probably most of our audience knows at this point that I've been renting for my whole life while still buying real estate investments in other markets.
Yeah, and I did the same thing for a long time. And a lot of people that I know in the investment banking space, as an example, I just use them because like they are pretty good capital allocators, but they all rent, most of them, because what, like it's a liquidity preference. So the preference that you just said, it's like for them, they're just paying a tax each month that they don't have to own their house, but they all of the money that they would otherwise have invested in their house, if they get a great deal that comes across their desk or a really good opportunity or trend in the market, they can take that $1 million or whatever that they would have had sitting aside for a house and put it into that opportunity, which is going to get them a better return than home ownership. The next piece, and this is what you mentioned, is what you do, is investor purchases. If easier home buying terms also apply to investors, some may purchase properties as rental investments. You get a ton of people right now buying, like a lot of people in our realist.ca course are doing the house hack. I literally have never like modeled so many house hack idea or like
Yeah,
concepts,
I love
but
it.
this is where we're at. And I love to see it where people are getting a portion of their home, their primary residence home purchased, subsidized by a tenant in the basement, or a garden suite in the backyard or whatever. Um, this piece could offset that shrinking tenant pool, maintaining or even increasing the supply of rental properties. And this is where that policy could actually move some of that investor demand, hopefully towards new houses. I know you and I were just on a call with a developer from Saskatchewan and, you know, a pre-construction broker here in Ontario, trying to basically figure out how to have a similar environment for pre-construction purchases in Saskatchewan. If we can get investors to be able to buy these properties that will cash flow, they're going to be creating housing supply in the process.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the last piece to consider here is, of course, the economy and the economic conditions. If the economy is growing, wages are rising, more people are buying new homes, likely shrinking the possible tenant pool, but what about the flip side? What if it was a weaker economy, even with easier home buying conditions? Some people may choose to continue just renting due to a little bit of uncertainty, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that things can get pretty volatile and no one can really plan for them.
Yeah, it is interesting when you think about it that way, because like you see a lot of people selling right now due to financial stress, and you know, in my perspective, a lot of those people would be, they would eventually go rent, like, and that could also put upward pressure on the, like if you just owned a house, but you still have 200K equity in it or 500K equity in it or whatever, but you just can't deal with the payments anymore. You don't want to default and you just want to take a break for a couple of years, wait for rates to come down, get your finances in order, right? You could sell and rent for a couple of years, and now all of a sudden, um, you're you're a seller putting supply into the resale market, and you become a tenant. And so it's really interesting to think about all of these factors at play right now while we're in such a dynamic economy where you've got unemployment rising, rents kind of stagnating, people moving all over the country. Now, huge policy changes being thrown in the mix like this. So you really want to think about what's that long-term impact on the rental market. And rents could stabilize or decline if the tenant pool shrinks and there's less competition for rental units. And landlords may have to reduce rents or offer more incentives to attract tenants. And I think you're seeing this in the condo space in downtown
Oh,
Toronto
big
right now.
time. Yeah.
But you could also see like a bit of a shift in rental demographics with many first-time homebuyers and exiting the rental market. The remaining tenant pool might consist of younger individuals, temporary residents, which there's a lot of, and you're really seeing Toronto evolving as one of like those gateway cities like New York or London. And by no means do I compare it in any other
I
way
was
than
going to say,
just calling it a
careful there.
gateway. But New York, I think like the average tenure of somebody living in New York would be like between 5 and 10 years, right? Somebody moves there, they get a good job, they meet some people, then they find the other place in the US that they want to move. London being the same thing, Toronto definitely being the same thing. I think like almost half of the permanent residents that come to Canada end up in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, or like the GTA. Um, and so thinking about that, but then also just people who prefer renting. And then I think like if the rental market loosens a little bit, you might see a lot of shift of like these downsizers who often believed in homeownership. But we have a really cool episode coming up about baby boomers and downsizing and millennials and Gen, what's the bus and no cap ones? Gen Z.
Gen Z's.
And
Yeah.
broccoli hair.
So mid. That's so mid, bro. Come
Is
on.
that good or bad? Mid.
I
Cap.
think I
Is it
think it's
cap? What's
mid.
a
I
cap?
think mid is just like that's
It's like in the
mid.
middle. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I mean, hey,
Makes
that's
sense.
that's the one that I have tried to adopt in my regular everyday speech.
Yeah, okay. That's man, we could probably get so much housing built if we changed it from missing middle housing to missing mid housing. You just got to brand it
I
probably,
love
just
it.
like those. Yeah. Anyway, I think like this is where there's so many factors, and um, formulating an investment thesis is like you just got to take all of these crazy inputs and just be like, okay, think back to the beginning of COVID, right? It's like there's only one person that I know that got it right, which was that Gary guy that I sent you on YouTube, Gary's Economics. He's brilliant, this guy. But he saw this huge run up in house prices. I didn't. I've always been bearish, and I got it right the most recent time, but I definitely got it wrong on the way into COVID. Like I remember going out with clients being like, "Oh, this feels like the scariest time ever to buy a house," and and the ones who did it made like I know somebody who literally made a 60% increase in 2 years on and sold and upsized into something else. They bought in 2020, like the week or two after the pandemic thing started. Anyway, point being, had you processed all of those inputs and made the right decision, you would have been the person making that massively outsized return of 60%, compared to, the, like, the people or me who thought the other way, right? Today, I think it's the same thing. You look at, okay, what's happening with tenants, what's happening with unemployment, what's happening with policy, et cetera. There's got to be like a formula, something you can formulate where if you get the right combination of, okay, I think these inputs is gonna the first order effects is gonna be this, the second order effects is gonna be that, and then all of a sudden you make a bet, you could have a massively better return. You could outperform anyone as an investor if you formulate your thesis right based on all of these inputs. And that's what this whole show is about. That's what we talk about on the course. That's what like our whole thing is about. It's like create an investment thesis. Don't just buy something with no guidance or no plan. Really, really think deeply about it. And that's what I'm challenging you to do in today's episode.
Yeah, I love that. Again, I think the investment thesis piece is lost on so many, but
Thesis
it cannot.
pieces.
I cannot stress how absolutely crucial having a well-formulated investment thesis is. And that's, again, Dan, as you said, one of the things that we focus on in the realist.ca course with almost 100 amazing members across the country. If that is not your cup of tea right now, then why don't you start things off by attending or joining one of our meetups? Almost 4,000 people in 24 cities across the country. I was looking at the map with all the red dots, and I was like, man, this is so cool. I don't even know if there's many other cities that we can put a red dot and get a meetup going in. So
only if we go to the US, probably.
Yeah, well, there you go. Then we've the North American takeover. So that's my advice today. Utilize the work that Dan and I have and the machine that Dan and I have built for you. Attend a meetup, link in the show notes, and join the realist.ca course. There is also a free version. We won free webinars. The next webinar is on VTB, vendor take back mortgages. It will be available and it's out later this week. So be sure to check that out.
And I guess we'll finish off with a review. I think we're doing those at the end now to remind you when this episode signs off that we want you to leave us a review. So this one says, what does it say? Amazing podcast. Having 5 stars, having recently purchased my first rental property, I can confidently say that this podcast and community they created on School, Realist in brackets, were key in the purchase. The podcast is incredibly valuable, packed with insights and information that provide a comprehensive overview of the current housing market. The best part is they also created the Realist community, which goes deeper and is also packed with information. I couldn't have achieved this without the help from Dan, and it actually says Mitch in the review, but I corrected it to Dan and Nick and Mitch. Thank you. Mitch is our business partner in the course. So thank you for leaving this review. I don't have the name. It says Hungry Bull 10 out of 10, which is a pretty sick reviewer name, actually.
Love it.
Thank you very much, Hungry Bull. Congratulations on your purchase. Glad we could be a part of it. I got to figure out who you are, but thanks a lot, everyone. Please leave us a review. Please come to a meetup. We love meeting all of you. Nick and I attend at least one meetup per month. And come check out our free webinar if you want to just see what Realist is all about and get a feel for like what kind of content we'll be doing in it. We do monthly free webinars, so make sure you come out to those. And the first one for this quarter of the year is September 20th at 11 a.m. And if you miss it, the recordings are always available, and they come with a lot of cool stuff like worksheets and checklists and clauses and term sheets that you need for this one's about vendor take back mortgages. So anyway, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you on Friday.